Okay. So, hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for signing on to this exciting virtual event. I would like to begin today by respectfully acknowledging that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Michi-Sagig Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teaching us about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. My name is Ashley Holmes, and I am a fourth-year forensic science and anthropology student. I also work with Lady Eaton College as a college ambassador. This year, I have been working with the Lady Eaton College office, as well as the Trent Forensic Science Society, to organize this panel discussion on forensic genealogy. Forensic genealogy is a new topic in forensic science, and we are excited to discuss it in more detail today. Before we begin, I would like to give a quick introduction to the members of today's panel. Firstly, we have our moderator, Kiara Parr. She is a third-year forensic biology student in the medical professional stream, as well as the co-president of the Trent Forensic Science Society. Next, we have Dr. Aaron Shafer. He is a professor here at Trent, where he focuses on genomic methods and conservation, wildlife management, and legal issues. Next, we have Dr. Barry Saville. He is a professor and the director of the Master of Science Forensic Science program here at Trent. His research focuses on population genetics, DNA, RNA genomics, and transcription analyses. Next, we have Professor David McNab. Professor McNab teaches the fourth-year advanced topics in law and policing course at Trent, and he was also a member of the Ontario Provincial Police until 2017, where he worked in general patrol and enforcement, investigations, and as a negotiator for the Central Region Crisis Negotiator Unit. Next, we have Dr. Mike Illes. Dr. Illes is a professor of forensic science here at Trent. Before his career in academia, he was a Canadian forensic science practitioner who taught forensic science internationally. Next, we have Dr. Christine Freeman-Roth. She is the principal of Lady Eaton College, as well as a member of Trent's philosophy department. She is interested in the philosophy of education and applied ethics, specifically ethical and legal issues in healthcare. Last but not least, we have Dr. Byron Stoyles. Dr. Stoyles is both a professor and the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Trent. His philosophical interests include ethics and law, and he is currently a member of the ethics committee at the Peterborough Regional Health Center. I would like to thank you all again for coming, and I will now pass things along to Kiara. Kiara will be moderating the event, and following the initial panel discussion, she will open the floor up to questions from attendees. You can use the Q&A function to type questions into the chat, and myself and Kiara will moderate them, and Kiara will pose them to the panelists as they come in. Off to you, Kiara.
Awesome, thank you, Ashley. So we will be starting off with quick little introductions from all of our panelists. I would like to bring the floor over to Dr. Shafer. Could you please tell us a little bit about your research, what you do, and how that applies to population genetics and forensic genealogy?
Sorry, Kira, real quick. Is this where I get to show my slides?
Not yet.
Okay.
Soon.
Yep, my background is in genetics, and where I'm interested in looking at how accurate these methods are. And so when it comes to genealogies and legal issues, I do a bit of research where we just estimate, we look at, can we reliably determine when you and I shared a grandparent or a great-great-grandparent based solely on our DNA?
Awesome, thank you. And Dr. Saville, could you tell us a little bit about your expertise in genetics, genomics, and RNA?
Thank you, Kira. Yes, my focus is really understanding the biological implications of changes in genomes and in transcriptomes. So from my perspective, the transcriptome is what I call the expressed genome. So you think about your genome is the same in every cell of your body, but your liver and your eyes are very different tissues, so we have to express different genes. And so I'm interested in that. So my relevance to forensic genealogy is more in the technical part of it. How do we get that information from a sample at a crime scene to something that somebody with the expertise of Dr. Shafer can analyze?
Awesome, that is a great question, and I'm very excited to delve into that a little bit further. Professor McNab, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
I joined the OPP in 1987, and I had a 30-year career largely as a road officer. I would have been one of the officers that attended a scene, a break and enter, or took the initial complaint of a sexual assault. Might have been the first at the scene of a homicide, that sort of thing. My job would be in that capacity, largely securing the scene, in some cases gathering evidence, but in the cases of a more serious prime we would call our identification services, the CSI of the OPP. So my job was really one of the initial steps in the whole process of linking evidence with suspects, and that was arriving at the scene and determining how to secure it and how to start collecting or allowing others to collect the evidence.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Dr. Freeman-Roth, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Absolutely. I am principal here at Laney College, and I also teach in the philosophy department. And my areas of interest are primarily in ethics, but in applied ethics. I'm really interested in how philosophy and ethical questions makes a difference in our daily lives, and how we make ethical judgments in situations of imperfect information. So we have to make decisions about things like how we use evidence, and specifically in healthcare, lots of really interesting questions there. And so I'm really interested in applying the principles and the ideas that we get in philosophy and ethics to real world situations. And I was just really struck by listening to a little clip from CBC driving in the morning, and really struck by all of the ethical issues that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about today.
We will definitely be going into depth about those because there's so many different opinions on the ethics and the philosophy of forensic genealogy. Let's go with Dr. Illes. Could you please give us a little bit of information about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So my background, like Dave, I work for the Ontario Provincial Police, but I worked for 24 years in the forensic identification services. So I attended crime scenes, and I also ended up managing the different units within the forensic guidance services for the OPP. My main work was crime scene investigations, and I also was a blood stain pattern analyst for the OPP. And so my background as far as academia, I came into academia after or kind of during the time when I was working as a practitioner, and now being full-time at Trent. My research then is very applied, and it expands really from, I've done research on statistical modeling in bloodstain pattern analysis all the way to forensic epistemology, where we were looking at reasoning skills for people that do crime scene work, and also justifications in areas like that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It'll be very interesting to get your take as well as Professor McNabb's take coming from ex-OPP officers. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Stoyles, could you please give a little intro?
Thank you. My interests relate to philosophical puzzles about ethics and about law. I'm interested in law, but I'm certainly not a lawyer. As a philosopher, I work to understand the nature of law and legal reasoning. Philosophers who are concerned with law consider, among other things, questions about when and how laws are binding, questions about the ways in which law might be related to morality, and on a very general level, questions about the values and principles that are or should be realized in systems of law. In this context, I'm interested in identifying which laws apply to regulate the collection and use of genetic information. It's really not clear. I also engage with questions related to privacy and why that's important, and problems related to obtaining consent to access personal information. And I think we'll jump into many of these issues today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Shafer, it is time to use your slides. Feel free to share your screen. And if you could give us a brief rundown about what forensic genealogy is, the methods, the practicality, and yeah, take it away.
Can you see this? Okay, so I thought it would be useful just to briefly explain how our DNA is used for reconstructing genealogies. So when you submit your DNA to these companies, they turn your information into these blocks. And so this is what my DNA looks like. And you can see I have all these different colored blocks. And these blocks reflect my ancestry. And if you were to look at my dad's blocks, he would have a very similar profile to me. And it turns out the length of these blocks are really, really informative. And so if you and I have a block that's in common, The only way that happens is if we shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent or a grandparent. So these methods use our blocks to reconstruct our genealogy. And the genealogies that they reconstruct look like this. In my world, we call it the coalescent. It's a fancy term. It's just a mathematical description of a big family tree. And I wanted to highlight two things. One, we use these blocks to reconstruct these genealogies. And in a population, most of us will have an ancestor pretty recently. So if I grab two random individuals from a population, these times refer to how far back in time do we go before you and I shared a grandparent. And in an average population, it happens pretty quickly. We don't have to go that far back to find a common ancestor, to share a great-great-grandparent. This is true for humans, this is true for wildlife. And so the programs and the companies reconstruct our genealogy. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is they talk in terms of generations. So any two individuals or any two samples, what they try to do is say, you two had a common ancestor 3 generations ago or 4 generations ago. In other words, you share a great-great-great-grandparent. And that's what the methods do. And these are constructed by population geneticists employed by the companies, and my lab does a lot of this type of research. So when you give a genealogy, when you give your DNA, the companies will immediately give you a genealogy. And so this is my genealogy from 23andMe. And hopefully the names are blurred. So I'm right here. And it turns out on 23andMe's database of roughly 10 million people, they have about 12 people that are my second cousin in this database. And the genealogy
Dr. Shafer? Okay,
Frozen.
so with that, I'm going to throw it over to Dr. Saville. Could you not continue where Dr. Shafer left off, but give, from your point of things, genomics and everything like that, give a little spiel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because this is a really great aspect of Erin's talk. Erin, if you were here us, you could probably click out and click back in. It would be awesome. Otherwise, we're going to have to get rid of his screen, Kira. Marvelous. So one of the exciting things about the genealogies that Dr. Shafer was talking about is at the bottom of that at that tree. Remember, we had that inverted sort of pyramid. At the bottom of that tree is where really close relatives are. And when we use forensic genealogy, it's those group of individuals we want to sort of see if we can find. The question is, how do you get from a crime scene to what Erin was talking about? And the answer is, well, you collect DNA. And to collect DNA at a crime scene, you have to be first aware that it's human DNA and that you will contaminate the DNA. So you need to make sure that you are in a position not to do that. You wear gloves, you wear a mask. Occasionally, probably you're going to be wearing a bunny suit too, a covering, so that you don't slough any of your DNA into the crime scene. You're going to collect things, and my colleagues, Doctors McNab and Illies will be more aware of this than I am. You're going to collect bodily fluids or bits of humans, right? And so basically you're looking at anything that could get DNA out of blood, semen, saliva, hair. Hopefully that hair has a hot follicle, skin, teeth, bones, those kind of things we can get DNA out of. And the DNA is isolated by standard procedures, and we have all sorts of beautiful techniques to get it clean. But the question I've always had, and the one thing I wonder about, is how much do we need? How much do we need for this new kind of technology, this genomic technology? So I went to Dr. Colleen Doyle in the NRDPFC Center. We have a forensics lab here at Trent, and Dr. Doyle is a researcher there. And she told me that she needs between 250 and 100 picograms of DNA to do genomic analysis. She prefers up to a nanogram, but she can do it with 100 picograms of DNA. What does that mean to you, an average person? Well, it means she can get enough DNA out of the follicle at the bottom of a hair. Okay, so that's how little DNA is required. Now, the reality is that at some crime scenes, you might not have that much. You might not have that much DNA. So that's one of the major problems with forensic genealogy, is that you usually need a nanogram. The companies that are doing this, they require a nanogram, and that's a lot. It's not a lot for you and I if we're having sugar in our coffee, but it's certainly a lot if you're trying to get DNA for genomic analysis. Okay, so they need an anagram. That's one of the problems. But when you get the DNA, the next thing you need to do is that you need to get that DNA to a point where you can sequence it. And when you sequence it, then you identify the variation that Dr. Shafer was talking about. And the variation is usually in the forms of little point changes, which we call single nucleotide polymorphisms. And those things are in the blocks that Aaron was talking about. And so that's when you do your analysis. And what you're looking for then, you take a crime scene sample and you look back and you say, okay, what are similar things? Like Aaron said, his father would have similar common denominators. That's what you look for in forensic genealogy. Who's a relative? Because the suspect's DNA is not in there, but we're looking for links. We're looking for something that we can pitch back to the officers on the scene and the investigators and say, here's a couple leads. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to do. Kira.
Wonderful, thank you. So what you're telling us is to wear a hairnet always.
Yes, and don't slough any skin off either.
Perfect, I'll do my best. Dr. Shafer, now that you are back, would you be able to continue where you left off?
Sorry about that. I live in the country and we had a power outage. But I'll be quick. And so if you can see my screen again, in current databases, if you have European ancestry, you have a second cousin there. But what I wanted to highlight is this is my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Baudreau. I found out about him through forensic genealogy. Interesting character. He was put to death by the US government. He settled the southern US in Louisiana. But one thing to remember with these genealogies is he was my great-great-great times 8 grandfather. So I have 256 great-grandparents at that level. And the challenge with forensic genealogy is if you were to trace my ancestry back to Jean-Baptiste and an unknown sample, that's informative, but there are about 10,000 people in the US that can trace their ancestry back to this individual. So the further you go back, the more descendants there are. And that's where it becomes challenging. So you could link me and somebody else to this individual, but there's 10,000 people that can also be linked to that individual. And so that's the other consideration. Our number of grandparents grow exponentially. So that's where I was going to end it, Kira.
Wonderful. I have a quick follow-up from the Q&A. Is forensic genealogy the same thing as DNA barcoding?
It is not. And so DNA barcoding is typically used to identify species. And forensic genealogy is using the variation that Dr. Saville talked about to figure out more or less our family tree and our ancestry. Barcoding it shares similarities in that it's DNA, but it's not reconstructing ancestry. That's a key difference.
Perfect, thank you very much. So now we're going to throw it to Professor McNab. We are wondering, what is your opinion on the police's influence over companies with suspect genetic information? So if you could draw on your own personal experience, talk on that.
My take on the whole police influence sort of thing is that it obviously raises a lot of ethical questions, and people worry about the police being able to collect evidence that they shouldn't. We see it on television, we see it in our real life, and it's a big question for everybody. But I would think that when the rules are set up for police, the rules of evidence gathering, the procedures we have to follow, they're quite strict. And if we abide by those, we're hopefully being ethical and legal. But if at any point we overstep our authority or we make any sort of an unethical move, the evidence will not be admissible. So a police officer attending a scene or trying to collect evidence along the way to match that evidence to a suspect is always bound by the obvious legality. We're not allowed to break the law in gathering evidence. And if we are very accountable. We can actually be charged under the criminal code for committing an offense. But ultimately, any evidence you gather is going to be thrown out. It won't be admissible and will be heavily criticized by the public, our supervisors, the Crown attorneys, and you quickly lose credibility with the public and credibility as an investigator. So I think all of that keeps that attempt at influencing individuals and companies in check very nicely. I would think that it's still possible to have those boundaries stretched or tested, but there are a lot of fail-safes to make sure it's not excessive.
Great, thank you very much. From that, I know you mentioned admissibility, and admissibility is often related to validation. So, Dr. Illes, would you please be able to enlighten us regarding the use of various forensic science methods in both the court and policing with and without proper validation?
Yeah, of course. I think I'll split this up into kind of two different areas. So first I'll talk about the scientific validity of methods and some of the historical methods that have been introduced into criminal investigations and into the courts. And then I'll talk about the possibility of future court challenges. So around the last decade or so, there's been a paradigm shift in forensic science. And this paradigm shift has suggested that there's a need for more science in forensic science. And there's been several reports and inquiries about this, and they've challenged the scientific validity of a number of disciplines within forensic science. So it's a bit of a wake-up call for forensic science. And one of the reports that I'm going to reference is it's referred to as a PCAST report. It's the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And this was a report that was provided to the President of the United States in 2016 on the state of forensic science in criminal courts, and essentially looking at ensuring the scientific validity of feature comparison methods. And a feature comparison method is something like the comparison of fingerprints or DNA. And these methods can individualize. And that's exactly what we're looking at for forensic genealogy. They're trying to individualize to a single person, or the other methods also may individualize to an item. So the PCAST found that DNA analysis of single source samples or simple mixtures of two individuals, such as you'd find in a sexual assault kit, is an objective method, and it's been established to be foundationally valid. So part of the reason for that is because the scientific validity came from research and the academic setting for DNA. So all of those scientific requirements, such as validity, repeatability, known error rates, peer review, and the list goes on, were essentially covered off before the science was introduced into criminal investigations and subsequently the courts. So this is clearly a good thing, and this discipline has withstood the challenges over time. So conversely, I wanted to talk about footwear comparison evidence. And the PCAST report found that there's no appropriate empirical studies to support the foundational validity of footwear analysis. And this is in having the ability to associate a shoe print with a particular shoe. And such conclusions are unsupported by any meaningful evidence, at least at the time of the report. And this is, of course, the opinion of the authors. So one of the reasons for this is because, for the most part, footwear identification was born out of the police community and not out of the research community. So the scientific requirements that I had mentioned earlier were really not covered off before the discipline was introduced into the criminal courts or criminal investigations and then the courts. So this is clearly a bad thing, and the discipline hasn't really withstood these challenges over time. So it was kind of like putting the cart before the horse and not doing the scientific research before the technique was being used in criminal investigations. So this could happen with forensic genealogy. So I think that there's a caution here, and the real question is, has forensic genealogy been sufficiently validated by the scientific community so that it could be used in these investigations? So there have been some lessons learned, and that I think we really need to be cautious about these new techniques that are being introduced in forensic science. And my second point about the possibility of future court challenges is, to my knowledge, forensic genealogy has not made its way into the criminal court system. But that doesn't, so it hasn't been challenged in the courts. So there definitely could be challenges, and there could be challenges in different areas. So one, there could be a challenge of the expert providing the expert opinion evidence. So do they have appropriate level of education? Have they been trained appropriately? Do they have experience to be able to provide this evidence? Is there accreditation, whether in the lab or possibly for individuals? Things like proficiency testing, and that continues on. Another challenge could be to the science, and I think Dr. Shafer and Dr. Saville kind of talked about that and gave us some ideas about that. Another challenge would be the application of the science, so the scientific method, and then finally the constitutional validity. And I really think it's going to depend on the context of the case and then how it's presented.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Learning about foundational validity and admissibility in court is definitely an important part of this topic. And another very, very important part, we're going to throw it over to Dr. Freeman-Roth to discuss some of the ethics of the situation. More specifically, we were wondering, what are some of the ethical and or philosophical dilemmas present in circumstances where direct-to-consumer companies such as 23andMe or Ancestry.com are required to divulge their private citizen information from their websites?
Thanks so much, Kira. So I think there are certainly concerns about requiring direct-to-consumer companies to divulge personal information. But we do have quite a robust history of examples of how we can do that and balance the interests of the public and the interests of the individual. So whether it's phone records or health records or your computer history, there are legal mechanisms that we can employ when those principles are followed. We can try to balance the principles of security against the principles of privacy. So I think when we are talking about companies being required to share information by court order, we have some checks and balances built in. I think the more challenging question is not when these companies are forced to share your data via the courts, but the myriad of ways that companies are probably sharing this data for profit or without clearly informed consent. So these direct-to-consumer companies work in an environment with very little oversight and regulation. Informed consent seems to be reduced to ticking a box, confirming that a very long and complex terms and conditions document has been read and understood. And while in some cases, explicit permission is sought by the company, again, via checking a box, that consumer consents to sharing information only under particular circumstances. So some of these companies say they will only release information, for instance, in the case of identifying the victim of a homicide or sexual assault. In other cases, the default is that the information will be shared, and that consumers are required to opt out of information sharing. So I think there remain many concerns about the way informed consent happens in practice. We can look to other areas that have dealt with some of these informed consent questions. And one of those is an area I've done work in, and that's around healthcare ethics. And in healthcare, there's a lot of work in what goes into meaningful informed consent. So I think that's where we want to ask the question, what does it mean to meaningfully consent to something? And this is based in a fundamental principle of autonomy. the notion that we need to respect patient, or in this case, consumer autonomy. And that is the ability to make decisions about themselves and what happens to their own bodies. And in order to do this from healthcare, we get a couple of requirements. So you need to be able to be competent to meaningfully consent. So you need to have the capacity to consent. You need to be provided with sufficient information about the options and the consequences of those options. More than just getting information, we need to ensure that a patient, or in this case, a consumer, understands the options and the consequences, and that they are providing voluntary consent that is neither coerced or under duress. It seems like most of these companies rely on simply being an adult to meet the capacity requirement. So you simply have to be 18. But many of these companies actually do allow a parent to consent on behalf of their child. So they can submit the DNA of their children for genetic analysis. I find that very concerning. And the mechanism for informing the consumer is primarily through this really long terms and service document. So I actually got a 23andMe kit for Christmas this year, and I'm actually really intrigued that Dr. Shafer has done this, because I just got completely stopped. I was like, I'm not sure I can understand this enough. I looked at the terms and conditions document. It is 20 pages long when I cut and paste it into a Word document. And I'm also asked to consent to a full privacy statement that is 22 pages long. So I have to read 42 pages of complex text. And even that, I have discovered listening just today that I really didn't understand the science. It certainly didn't tell me what was happening. So there's that piece about being competent, the piece about being informed and actually understanding it. And then there is the issue of being under duress or coercion. And there just simply isn't any mechanism in the process for consenting to be able to determine whether or not someone is under duress. You check a box. What would their motivation be for agreeing? There are so many pieces we could unpack here. There's questions of privacy versus security. There are questions about property. Is your DNA yours? Because it gives information not just about you, but about all of your ancestors, your relatives, and your descendants. So you are consenting when you share this information. You're consenting to share information about children you may not have even thought of having, and their children. And so can we truly understand the implications of what might happen 20 years from now for those people? I'm going to stop myself because otherwise I'll keep going.
That was wonderful. There, as you mentioned, there is so much to unpack with the ethics behind these decisions, and more specifically, the consequences that can happen if you do just check off that box, I consent. So to get a little deeper into that, Dr. Stoyles, could you explain the legal implications of informed consent and of just checking off a box without hypothetically reading the long paper that goes with it?
Yes, I absolutely can. So the first thing to consider from my perspective is what laws are actually binding here. And what we find when we dig into the legal perspective is that for a variety of reasons, lawmakers are playing a game of catch up whenever people find new ways of acting and interacting with the use of technologies. And so this game is inherently reactive. And in the absence of clearly applicable law, the genealogical companies, like the ones Professor Freeman-Roth was speaking about, make and remake their own policies. So genetic databases such as the ones supported by GEDMatch or GEDMatch are user-sourced, meaning that the databases are built as users voluntarily submit their DNA or genetic profiles. This is the database that was used in the process that led to the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. Users were outraged to find out that their profiles that they've uploaded had been used for this purpose. They knew full well that when they provided their profiles, they would be used to compare their profiles with other people's. That's what you need to do to get information about your own ancestry and to make the connections that you would upload the information for in the first case. So GEDMatch changed their policies following the user outrage, and the policies allowed a new option, an opt-in option. And so like the mechanisms Professor Freeman-Roth was identifying, users had to actually click that they opt in to allowing their information and their profiles to be shared with law enforcement agencies. Very few users actually did that. This was a year after the information had already been used. So effectively, no law was in place that governed in the first instance. But more importantly, since the opt-in policy has been put in place, and noting that many users did not opt in to allowing law enforcement agents to access their information, GEDMatch's complete database has been made available on multiple occasions in response to legal warrants. And so the protection provided, even when a mechanism for consent is in place, is really flimsy. I don't want to suggest there are no laws. To be sure, laws, including in Canada, have laws related to privacy and laws related to consent. I see someone had a question about the Canadian Charter issues in the question and answer segment. This is certainly one mechanism for protecting individuals by law, but it's not obvious that the privacy laws in Canada have any teeth. If I have a complaint, the companies that has collected my personal information is based in the US, for instance. Perhaps the US law applies, but this isn't clear either. The problem of jurisdiction is exacerbated by the fact that people often generate new ways of circumventing regulations in effect in the various places. So using proxy servers, for example. Now already it's been mentioned that some of the rules and some of the laws and some of the practices have yet to be checked in courts. And this is also true of what I would call the one-click agreements, where you click, I agree to all the terms and services. And there are significant problems. Professor Freeman-Roth has identified a number of them. What are the problems? We're not well informed. Who the hell reads the 40+ pages? But more importantly, who the hell understands all of that? And as I've just suggested, that's not all legally binding in any case, or at least it's not going to be followed in any case in some instances. So we can't reasonably say that we know what's going to happen with our information when this goes. But the other reality, and this is a practical reality, is most people don't do what it takes to change their settings. So if the company have an opt-in option like GEDMatch does, a small fraction of users actually click this. But there's another, Family Tree DNA is another service, a direct-to-customer service. They have an opt-out mechanism. And we know that about 5% of users have clicked the opt-out option. So the evidence is whatever the default settings are is what the majority of users are going to have. And that suggests we don't have any meaningful consent going on. There's no agreement, there's no engagement with the information, and there's, in many cases, no activity that relates to anything as robust as giving consent in any other area of law. So I'll stop myself there.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Now we would like to learn a little bit about a hypothetical case. So Dr. Shafer, we are wondering what specific types of genetic information are taken into account in, for example, sexual assault cases, and what analyses are performed and where they are performed. I know there has been a question in the Q&A that I believe Dr. Illes answered, but if you could just quickly touch on it, where these analyses are performed. Are they performed in police labs, separate areas like the CFS, etc.?
Yeah, maybe I'll defer to the former officers where they're performed. I can tell you the markers are not what we're discussing today. Generally speaking, they're what we would call STRs, but they carry no information about your external characteristics. To some extent, they carry information about your ancestry, but they're useful for unique identification. So they would never go to a company like this for the SNP analysis, as Dr. Saville talked about. As to where they're performed, I'll let somebody else maybe speak to that, because I don't directly, I do all of my sequencing at Trent or in Toronto.
the DNA centers are, Mike and David will hopefully be able to talk about this, but the Center of Forensic Science, various RCMP labs have DNA sequencing capability or DNA analysis, as this is STR analysis, which has gone through all this ethical review, the STR stuff, and passed it, although I'm sure there's still undercurrents. But usually, yeah, it's in these specific forensic labs. Did the IDENT labs have DNA analysis, Mike?
No, all the forensic identification officers essentially are gatherers and hunters for that type of thing. So they would collect the sample at the crime scene, and then they would send it into the labs that you mentioned. So in Canada, these are certified labs. As Barry had mentioned, the Center of Forensic Science, there are 2 labs, one in Toronto and one in Sault Ste. Marie. The RCMP have a number of labs, and then there's also a provincial lab in Quebec, and that's about the only ones that that these samples would go to. And then there may be the odd time that a lab doesn't perform a particular type of analysis, like an RNA analysis, and the police would then have to go to perhaps a private lab, but those are decisions that aren't made off the cuff. So they're, and they make sure that these labs are, or they should make sure that these labs are accredited, certified, and all of those things. Yeah. So the companies should not be getting the sample that would be removed from the crime scene.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Dr. Freeman-Roth. Would you be able to speak to motivations of companies with respect to jurisdictional problems?
Sure. I mean, of course, I can't speak to the motivation of any particular company, but these are for-profit businesses, and they are beholden to their shareholders. They are located in various places around the world, and they are subject to different kinds of regulations and pressures from different bodies. So while we may have some, although not great, regulations about these companies in Canada, and there may be very clear rules of evidence and how this kind of evidence is used in our system, I don't know that we have any sort of reason for feeling confident that our information will be protected if it is being held somewhere else. So there are, of course, concerns about data breaches, that this information could be accessed by an outside company, an outside individual. Of course, these companies have a vested interest in having good security. But I don't know that a company that might relocate out of this jurisdiction and into another country for some tax break will suddenly be under the purview of another government and have to turn over data. I think it's really difficult to predict how this kind of data might be used. And so as an individual, that makes me feel a little bit concerned. But as individuals, we might still say, I don't plan on committing a crime, and I want my DNA to be used to help for research, for understanding diseases. There's lots of different motivations people have when they use these companies. So I think it's just pointing to some more of these challenges about what the motivations are for people when they get their DNA analyzed, and the motivations of companies in terms of how they share that information. I want to see perpetrators caught just like everyone else does, but it's just understanding and thinking about some of those additional issues.
That actually is a perfect segue into one of the Q&A questions. Dr. Stoyles, from a philosophical point of view, Claudia asks, with the Charter of Rights, the general sense is simplistic in terms as you do as you please, but you just don't harm others. Would withholding your genome violate this, as you are bringing harm to other people by not directly helping find a criminal? And would that go against the harm principle or not?
That's a really hard question to answer. I think there's a lot going on here. I think that this is a very simplistic way to think about what the Charter does. And so the Charter protects individual rights, privileges, and so on, and outlines obligations in relation to those rights and privileges and freedoms and so on. But it's mostly a mechanism to ensure that our legal and political institutions mostly don't infringe on individuals' rights. So I'm not sure how far that goes. The harm principle is a really interesting question. So I think I agree with Professor Freeman-Roth, and I agree with the suggestion that's implied in the question that it's a good thing that we're catching criminal wrongdoers. It's a good thing that we're catching murderers and people who assault other people and so on. But let me suggest that there are other harms involved. So I want to suggest that this isn't as easy as it first seems. So first, there's a matter of privacy. We have a chartered protection of privacy, and this means that our personal information should be protected. Personal information includes anything about identifiable individuals. On this understanding, it can include anything that can be used to identify an individual, and certainly our genetic information fits that bill. So I recently came across an ad from My True Ancestry, and we hear a person with a very deep and concerned voice saying you should use their services. I should get close to my mic. To discover who you really are. So the companies want you to believe that this is personal information, and they're making it available to other people. That's a question related to harm and privacy. But a second answer that we haven't considered, and I'll throw it out there briefly, is a concern about mass surveillance. So the more data that's available to our governing bodies and our enforcement agencies, the more people assume a scenario like the one George Orwell described, in which Big Brother is watching you. And civil liberty groups have resisted mass surveillance insofar as they think it's a harm when we cut against the assumption that we shouldn't be under the scrutiny of the state unless for legitimate reason. And so that's not a direct answer to your question, but just to say, I think there's a lot more going on when we think about how harm is related and whether the harm principle applies. But it's a great question.
Dr. Shafer, I will get to you in just 1 second. Professor McNab has had his hand up for quite a while, and I just want to throw it back to him.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm hearing we sort of circle around to the whole discussion about privacy versus solving crime. And I think everybody agrees that any technique that allows us as police, I speak like I'm still a present police officer, but allows the police community to solve crimes is a good one. We have public safety always being sort of in opposition to privacy. And whether we realize it or not, that's a question that arises almost all day, every day. So I think that when we ask the question, is it okay to breach privacy to solve crimes? I think a better question might be, when is it okay to breach privacy to solve crimes? Because public safety or security will always involve a sacrifice in terms of privacy. And the balance determining when it's right and under what circumstances is probably a more accurate question. Interestingly enough, Dr. Freeman-Roth was talking about the whole consent box and whether people are even reading this. And in the case of the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessup, they actually used the genealogy through a family tree DNA, and the fellow identified the lady as Ken. Ken's DNA that he submitted for personal reasons was used to solve that crime. But as it turned out, he actually said, I don't remember ever ticking the box or consenting. I'm okay with it. Fortunately, he was fine with it, but he didn't remember ticking the box. But I think along those lines of people's concerns about privacy versus protection, I think it would help the public to understand that our Hollywood notion of getting a warrant where the police just disappear for half an hour and come back with a warrant is very unrealistic. The police collecting evidence is it's governed by the judicial system very heavily, so that as a police officer, when I went to get a search warrant, I would have to write a search warrant. It could involve 12 hours of solid writing or sometimes 48 hours. It's a lengthy process, very detailed. And you have to convince a judge all sorts of, there are a lot of hoops to jump through to breach someone's privacy. You have to describe the location or the scene of the crime. You have to describe what evidence you're seeking, whether it's bank records, physical records, or DNA comparison. You have to convince the judge that it's crucial for the investigation, that the crime it pertains to is serious enough to warrant a breach of the privacy. And you also have to convince the judge that it's reasonable to gain that information in the manner you're asking for. So if it's a search of genealogy or bank records. And you have to convince the judge that there are no more reasonable or unobtrusive means of getting that evidence. So all of these things are written into a search warrant, and the judge will make a very careful consideration and will carefully weigh the question of privacy versus security. So it's not a police officer making that determination. It's a judge with a lot of experience and a lot of understanding of the law. So there is some protection for the public in that whole process.
I do have a follow-up. I will get to the rest of you in a minute. An attendee asked on the terms of warrants and jurisdiction, hypothetically, if we were to send out our DNA to an American company, would it still be under Canada's jurisdiction or the US if you hypothetically committed a crime? This is for Professor McNab or Dr. Illes, whoever prefers to pull this one.
Could I just clarify, the question then is relating to if you want to use a USA database, whether you'd have to obtain a Canadian search warrant to do so?
Yes, would they be able to use a Canadian search warrant to obtain your DNA from an American-based databank?
It's a great question. It's not very often that you would be searching or obtaining a search warrant for obviously a physical property in the USA. It just doesn't happen. But I would imagine you'd need, and Dr. Illes, I'm going to ask you to confirm, I would imagine you'd need a warrant in both Canada and the USA.
Yeah, I would think so, but I guess it depends on the context of the situation. If essentially, if the police service had sent information to one of these companies in the United States, all they're essentially asking them to is do a search. And as that company goes through, they may get hits on different individuals that had submitted their DNA, and eventually narrow it down to a relative, so who becomes a suspect. And then, so that, I'm not even sure what the legal ramifications are of that. To be honest, you really haven't taken any DNA yet from the suspect themselves. After that, then there's laws in Canada if the suspect's in Canada and how a DNA sample is connected, then they would be applied. So it's kind of a complex question to answer.
You did a great job answering it. So just if anyone cares, you can stick around for a little bit longer. Panelists, if you do need to leave, we completely understand. Thank you so much for coming and attending this panel. I think the discussions have been wonderful, very thought-provoking, especially with the background of ethics. That was really, especially Dr. Freeman-Roth, when you brought up the child consent, where parents can give consent on behalf of their children. That is definitely something to think about. We do have a few other questions in the chat that we would love to ask about. Before we get to that, Dr. Shafer, you had a point a little while ago, if you want to get to that.
Yes, Byron mentioned mass surveillance, and I just wanted to add with these databases, I think, quite frankly, if you're part of a marginalized community, or if you were a protester at Tahrir, like in Egypt, I'd have serious concerns about a database where I upload my DNA and I get a list of relatives. And I think that maybe doesn't apply necessarily to policing in Canada, but that's one of the considerations I think we need to think about with these databases. The last thing about the databases is they're not completely anonymous. Studies have been able to re-identify people, attribute last names to profiles. The current databases, there's enough information there where I could reconstruct your DNA profile. And so there's a lot. I mean, we're only scratching the surface with some of these considerations, but I wanted to just follow up on surveillance comment.
So hypothetically, if I were to commit a crime, I have not done a 23andMe, any sort of DNA test. And if I committed a crime and I left my DNA, my DNA is not in the criminal data banks as of yet, would the police still hypothetically be able to find my DNA through relatives who might have done those DNA tests?
Yes.
And specifically, what relatives would be best for that?
Well, your brother or sister would be best, but then, or your parents, but if they're not there, then they'd have to go further back. But would you agree, Aaron?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so don't let anyone in my family take DNA tests.
Oh, everybody should take a DNA test.
The challenge here, Kara, is I have 12 cousins in the genealogy, and I don't know any of them. And I don't even think my parents know who those people are.
Interesting. So you have no control. People don't have control over it, which is the key aspect.
Well, there were decisions made.
True, but you don't have control over what other people do, of course, because of their own consent, especially if they're that far removed.
It's interesting, if I can jump in, to consider the implications of another point that Christine Freeman-Roth raised, and that's that, and this is directly related, when you input your information, it actually counts as personal information about other people, and thus privacy laws should cover that and all of the ethics related to privacy. But we can consider that there are really important consequences. Some people don't want to be identified. And not only because they're criminals, or they could be suspects in criminal trials, but they just don't want to be known in this way. The Golden State Killer didn't have a profile on GEDMatch, but members of his family did, and they identified him using that. The suspect, Calvin Hooper, identified in the case of Christine Jessup, which was mentioned a minute ago, he was identified in the same way. He's dead. But look what happened. When he was identified as Jessup's killer, his family was also identified as the family of a rapist and killer. And the family has said they're devastated to find out this news, and they're struggling to come to terms with the horrendous news that they think was as shocking to them as it was to Jessup's family. So they don't mean to suggest that their situation is as bad as the victims, but it certainly has implications. And in this respect, it's worse when the news media can be digging for more information about suspects, and they have the names and identities of the people. So they actually knock on people's doors. I understand that your cousin was, and that has serious implications beyond what an individual user might consent to.
Yeah, definitely. That could open up major psychological trauma for the families of the victims, as well as the families of the perpetrators. Thank you for that. Dr. Saville, we see that you do want to answer a question posed in the Q&A. The question is, in what circumstances would you need to perform a more specific RNA test rather than general DNA testing?
Thank you, Kara. This is the one I often give an example of when I'm talking about DNA analysis in classes. Hopefully our audience isn't too squeamish. Consider a rape case. And the rape case that I'm talking about, the individual that raped the female used a beer bottle. And we use a beer bottle, and the defense of the individual is that, well, of course, my DNA and her DNA is on that bottle. We shared a beer together. And so there wouldn't be any indication of where the DNA came from if it was just a DNA sample. However, if we were doing an RNA sample, we would be able to tell from the material left on the bottle what part of the body that sample came from. And in this case, perhaps vaginal fluid would be on the bottle, and we would be able to detect that. So we can actually use RNA to talk about more circumstances than DNA.
Great, thank you. That was very thorough. We have another question. Someone is asking, this can go to any of you, but specifically the science professors. Sorry, it just disappeared. but I'll try and remember it.
I'm busy answering questions, so maybe that was me.
Maybe it was you. In terms of technology, do we think that it will advance in the upcoming years? And if so, how far will this advancement go? If not, why? That was the rough question. I can't remember it fully.
I don't think Aaron and I would be here if we didn't think science was going to advance.
Yeah,
You want to answer it, Aaron? I think the answer is yes, it will advance, and I have some ideas of where it might go.
yes, and I think you can. I mean, if you think of cell phones, they were probably not even on the radar in police investigations in the '60s, and so maybe Mike and David could speak to that. But yeah, I think we embrace technology and it's going forward.
Yeah, and I think that the DNA. I think that the video surveillance is going to be, it's going to be as meaningful as the DNA stuff. Mike?
If I could comment now, I think the DNA has been a huge breakthrough just in the 30 years that I've been policing. It's probably a bigger breakthrough than the whole fingerprint, the application of fingerprint evidence in terms of being able to identify people. And obviously a key component in this is the database that we're able to access to actually reach out across a wide geographical range and identify suspects. It's a huge breakthrough.
So thank you to Jeffries for DNA fingerprinting. More specifically, thanks, Dr. Saville. I have another question. What other kinds of ethical questions like this have happened in the past? So I believe this attendee is asking about different circumstances or cases that have brought up ethical questions similar to the ones we've discussed today.
I'll start the ethicist off. I mean, the real ethics have come out in many areas, right? When we first came up with using DNA, there was a major concern, and that's why the specific databases in both the United States and Canada have very strict rules on who can access it and who will be represented there. But also, you know, if you go beyond the law, the whole concept of molecular biology and genetic modification, those are all huge ethical things, but that would get into another hour conversation. So, but I think the original CODIS loci, for example, were the first major one.
Wonderful.
Maybe I can just speak. I think there are so many that it's almost hard to narrow it down. And as this is something we see with advancements in all technologies, I think we didn't anticipate. So when I leave hair in the shower at the gym, or I throw my coffee cup out, recycle, of course, my coffee cup, it wasn't something I would have thought about, that maybe I could be identified, and that information that I just innocently left could be used in some way that I hadn't thought about it. And we see the same thing in facial recognition software, in all sorts of different kinds of monitoring. So there are things that we take for granted that as technology changes, suddenly opportunities to take advantage of that information, to use that information in malicious ways, for people to use it in ways it wasn't intended. All of those things open up. So we always have to keep asking these questions as the situation changes. And the challenge is that the advancements happen so quickly, the regulations lag, and our thoughts about them, they lag behind. So we end up with these situations where we're responding after the fact, after something we've identified now as a violation occurs. So it is a constant thing that we have to keep monitoring. And those are sort of questions where philosophy and science intersect. That we can do something, it doesn't mean we should do something. And we should always be asking that question, I think.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there with the ethical dilemmas and the philosophical understandings behind this all. I'm gonna give it to Professor McNab, and then after that, everyone can make their own final comments on the topic.
So I'll throw it out there expectedly, or I think as people would expect. I'm a big fan of solving crimes through the use of evidence, and quite comfortable with the fact that there are enough safeguards in place that the breach of privacy doesn't concern me as much. But we've always had the whole concept of consent and informed consent in other areas of law. It's not a new concept, even though it's a new application of the concept. But it's something I haven't heard asked yet, and I've expected that with regard to ethics. One of the things about consent is it has to be informed. We've talked about that, but it also has to be revocable. So if I submit my DNA sample as a private citizen, and then I decide I don't like where this is going and I've become more informed, can I go back in and untick the opt-in box? Can I make those changes? Could I even withdraw my sample and ask them to destroy it? Those are questions I think we also have to ask, and we have to have those safeguards in place to make sure that people can withdraw or change their mind and withdraw their samples or their consents.
Yeah, I think that's one of the lines that Christine had to read that said, no, you can't. But
so then if the option is not there to withdraw your consent, that in other cases, such as the searching of a car, if I've got consent to search somebody's trunk, they suddenly see that it's not going well, they can withdraw that. If you don't have that in place for this application, I would say that maybe the consent is not lawful or shouldn't be.
Some of the companies take the perspective that the information is owned by the consumer and that they can revoke they can ask for that information to be removed at any point. Other companies, the answer is different. But I think from what I'm learning from Dr. Shafer is it may not matter if you remove your specific information. It might already be in a kind of aggregated way in the system. So I don't know if by removing your specific sample or record of the sample, whether you've actually successfully removed your information.
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. 23andMe is selling your data. That's how they're making money. But the anonymization of it, you can be re-identified in some circumstances and in some databases.
So then it does come back to the question, is it lawful despite being able to take your sample back? Is that still lawful to have that whole consent there? I want to thank everyone. Does anyone have any final remarks they would like to add before we wrap up? Okay, wonderful. Thank you to everyone. That includes the attendees and the participants, as well as the panelists. This has been great. Your expertise is fascinating on the topic. There's definitely a lot. I will be thinking about this for the rest of the day and the ethical considerations, dilemmas, and everything. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw it back to Ashley just to finish up.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. This was great. Yeah, that's about it. So we'll wrap it up here. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.